February 1945, 20,000 feet over Germany. Ball turret gunner Staff Sergeant James Wilson's oxygen hose ruptures during a fighter attack. The thin air at this altitude gives him maybe 3 minutes of consciousness. But the hydraulics are damaged. His turret won't rotate back to the entry position. He's trapped inside a plexiglass sphere with oxygen running out, and the mission has 6 more hours to go. He survived. This is how, at 20,000 feet, the air contains about half the oxygen available at sea level. Your body cannot sustain consciousness. Without supplemental oxygen, you have roughly 60 seconds of useful consciousness before confusion sets in. Within 3 minutes, you'll pass out. Within 10 to 15 minutes without oxygen, brain damage occurs. Within 30 minutes, you're dead. Ball turret gunners depended entirely on oxygen supplied through a hose running from the aircraft's main system down through the narrow tunnel into the turret. The hose had to be long enough to allow the turret to rotate fully. But length made it vulnerable. Combat damage, sharp movements, or equipment failures could rupture or disconnect it. The emergency backup was a small oxygen bottle mounted inside the turret, a walk-around bottle designed to give you maybe 10 to 15 minutes of air if your main hose failed. Just enough time to get the turret rotated back to the exit position. Crawl out and connect to another oxygen source in the main fuselage, but Wilson's turret wouldn't rotate. The hydraulic lines that powered turret movement had been hit by the same flak burst that ruptured his oxygen hose. He could manually crank the turret using the backup hand crank system, but that took 15 to 20 minutes of exhausting work. His emergency bottle had maybe 12 minutes of oxygen. The math didn't work. Here's what made his situation even worse. The rest of the crew couldn't help him. The Ball turret was a completely isolated position. Nobody could reach him from inside the aircraft while he was in the turret. To get him out, the turret had to rotate to align the entry hatch with the fuselage opening. Without hydraulics, only he could crank it into position from inside. If he passed out from oxygen deprivation while trying to hand crank the turret, he would die in that sphere and nobody could reach him. Wilson had one advantage most Ball turret gunners didn't have: he'd grown up at high altitude in Colorado. His body had adapted to function on less oxygen than someone raised at sea level. This physiological adaptation, called hypoxic tolerance, meant he could potentially remain conscious slightly longer than the typical 3-minute window at 20,000 feet, but he also knew something critical from his training: oxygen deprivation affects your judgment before you lose consciousness. Hypoxia makes you confused, impairs decision-making, and creates euphoria that makes you think everything is fine even as you're dying. Hypoxia kills you by making you too confused to save yourself. Wilson made a split-second decision that violated every instinct. Instead of immediately switching to his emergency bottle and starting the desperate hand crank procedure, he stayed on the ruptured main oxygen line for another 30 seconds while he methodically checked every connection point in the oxygen system inside his turret. He was gambling that the rupture wasn't complete, that some oxygen was still flowing through the damaged hose, even if not enough to sustain consciousness indefinitely. Those 30 seconds cost him precious time, but the information was critical. If he could determine where the rupture was and how much oxygen was getting through, he could calculate whether he had any option beyond the emergency bottle's 12-minute limit. His gamble paid off. The main hose was partially torn, not completely severed. Oxygen was flowing, but at maybe 40% of normal rate. Not enough to sustain consciousness indefinitely, but enough to extend his useful time significantly if he could control his breathing and exertion rate. Wilson switched to his emergency bottle and immediately began the hand crank procedure to rotate the turret. But instead of cranking frantically, which would have burned through oxygen faster, he cranked slowly and deliberately. Every few cranks, he would stop, rest for 10 seconds, breathe slowly, and let his oxygen saturation recover slightly before continuing. This was counterintuitive. Every instinct screamed to crank as fast as possible before the oxygen ran out. But Wilson understood the physiology. Exertion burns oxygen. Panic breathing burns oxygen. Slow, controlled effort conserves oxygen. He was betting that slow progress with efficient oxygen use would get him further than fast progress with rapid oxygen depletion. After 8 minutes of careful hand cranking, Wilson had rotated the turret about 60 degrees, roughly halfway to the exit position. His emergency bottle gauge showed less than 3 minutes of oxygen remaining. The math was obvious. He couldn't complete the rotation before his oxygen ran out. He faced an impossible choice. Option 1. Continue hand cranking until his emergency bottle ran out, then switch back to the partially ruptured main oxygen line and hope the reduced oxygen flow would sustain consciousness long enough to complete the rotation. The risk was passing out from hypoxia before reaching the exit position. Option 2. Stop cranking now, switch back to the main hose, breathe the reduced oxygen flow, and wait for the aircraft to descend to lower altitude where the thin air wouldn't require supplemental oxygen. The risk was the mission might not descend for hours, and gradual oxygen deprivation would eventually cause him to pass out anyway. Wilson chose a third option nobody had trained him for. He used his emergency bottle to buy himself a detailed assessment of his exact physical state. He checked his pulse, elevated but not dangerously high. He checked his mental clarity by doing math calculations in his head, still functioning. He checked his field of vision, no tunneling yet. He was hypoxic, but not critically so. He switched back to the main line with the partial flow. The reduced oxygen hit him immediately, slight dizziness, a feeling of breathlessness. But he remained conscious. He resumed hand cranking, even slower now, stopping every 3 cranks to rest and breathe. His calculated bet was that the partial oxygen flow plus his hypoxic tolerance plus carefully controlled exertion would keep him conscious just long enough to complete the rotation. The crew in the main fuselage had no idea what was happening. Wilson's intercom connection had been damaged along with the oxygen and hydraulics. They knew his turret was stuck because they could see it hadn't returned to the stowed position. They assumed he was manually cranking it but had no way to know about his oxygen situation. At the 14-minute mark, Wilson felt euphoria beginning, the classic sign of severe hypoxia. His brain, starved for oxygen, was creating false feelings of well-being. This was the danger point. Hypoxic euphoria kills pilots and climbers regularly because it makes you feel fine even as you're dying, but Wilson recognized it. That recognition meant he still had enough brain function to override the false signals. He forced himself to keep cranking. 3 cranks, rest, breathe. 3 cranks, rest, breathe. His vision started tunneling, peripheral vision darkening. Another classic hypoxia symptom. He was maybe 60 seconds from losing consciousness. At 16 minutes, the turret clicked into position. The entry hatch aligned with the fuselage opening. Wilson unstrapped, disconnected from the main oxygen line, and crawled through the hatch on pure adrenaline with maybe 15 seconds of consciousness remaining. Hands grabbed him from inside the fuselage, pulled him through, slammed an oxygen mask on his face connected to the main aircraft system. Wilson regained full consciousness after about 2 minutes on good oxygen. Medical check when they landed showed no permanent damage. His calculated risk-taking and physiological understanding had saved his life. But the real story is what the Army Air Force learned from his survival. After Wilson's incident report, the Air Force modified ball turret oxygen systems on newer B-17 models. They added redundant oxygen bottles with independent supply lines. They improved the durability of oxygen hose routing to make ruptures less likely. They added quick disconnect fittings so a gunner could detach from a damaged line and switch to backup supply in seconds rather than fumbling with threaded connections. More importantly, they changed the training. Gunners were now specifically trained on hypoxia recognition, controlled breathing techniques, and calculated decision-making under oxygen deprivation. Wilson's slow hand crank method became part of official emergency procedures. The manual specifically instructed that if oxygen was limited, slow cranking with rest intervals was more effective than rapid continuous cranking. The modifications and training changes came too late for most of the war, but they influenced post-war military aviation. Modern military aircraft oxygen systems include multiple redundancies, automated backup systems, and sophisticated monitoring specifically because incidents like Wilson's proved that oxygen system failure in combat was a critical vulnerability. Wilson's survival came down to three factors. First, his physiological advantage from growing up at altitude gave him extra tolerance. Second, his understanding of hypoxia let him recognize symptoms and manage his condition. Third, and most important, his ability to override instinct and make calculated decisions under life-threatening stress. That third factor is what separates survival from death in extreme situations. Panic kills. Instinct often kills. Calculated risk-taking based on understanding your actual condition and resources, that's what saves lives. Wilson had maybe 16 minutes from oxygen failure to reaching safety. He used those minutes more effectively than someone with better equipment and more oxygen would have if they panicked. The Ball turret was the most isolated, most vulnerable position on AB-17. But gunners like Wilson proved that even in that position, with equipment failures that should have been fatal, survival was possible through knowledge, discipline, and calculated decision-making. His 6 hours trapped at 20,000 feet, most of it on partial oxygen after his emergency bottle ran out, became a case study in how to survive the unsurvivable.